Hello there. Good afternoon. I'm Sequoia Miller, Chief Curator at the Gardner Museum. Welcome as folks start joining in. Delighted that we could connect with Julie Moon today and have a bit of a studio visit. So we're just going to join Julie here. Hello.
Hi, Sequoia.
Hi, Julie. How are you?
Not too bad. Not too bad. How are you?
Great. I'm good. I'm good.
Good,
Welcome.
good.
Wonderful. Wonderful to see you. Wonderful to be here. Hello and welcome to everyone. I'm Sequoia Miller, Chief Curator here at the Gardner Museum in Toronto, and delighted to be here today for a studio visit with Julie Moon. So hello and welcome, Julie. Woohoo.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, folks, for those of you who are less familiar with Julie and her work, I'll give just a super quick intro before we start the conversation. So, Julie is a ceramic artist and sculptor based in Toronto. She frequently works with clay. Julie has a BFA from OCADU, the Ontario College of Art and Design, from 2005 and earned an MFA, a Master's in Fine Art, from the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University in 2010. Prior to those two degrees, she studied fashion and worked in Toronto's garment industry. Since 2010, Julie, you've been working in the US and in Canada and in other places, but you've been here now in Toronto for a good chunk of time. And I'm wondering if you could maybe start by telling us like where you are physically.
So I'm located in the Distillery District. This building is part of Artscape, which is a nonprofit organization that provides affordable or market rate studio and live workspaces for artists. So it's been awesome. I've been here for 5 years. Unfortunately, the lease is up in like just over a year. So I'm going to have to pack soon.
Right. You don't want to be thinking about it, but always good to
Yeah.
put out feelers.
Uh,
Yeah, for
yeah.
sure. 5 years
Mhm.
is a good run in a studio. Do you feel like you've sort of grown into the space as an artist and started to understand yourself and your work and your process kind of in relation to the space that you're occupying?
Well, I feel like I adapt generally to any space that I'm in. So if you give me a lot of space, I'll take up a lot of space. If you give me very little space, I'll sort of work around it. So I think I've always been pretty flexible about, what the boundaries are in terms of the space that I'm in.
Mm,
Um, and I am an introvert, so I do kind of feel like this past year has been a little bit, kind of comfortable for me, you know,
hmm.
um, and it's also given me a chance to kind of slow down and really sort of unpack my own practice. And maybe I'm also going through a midlife crisis partially at the same time. So there's a lot
Right.
of reflecting going on.
Yeah, interesting. So
Mhm.
I'm really curious about how, the year has been so, of course, so much upheaval in so many different ways and on so many different levels. And I think for a lot of studio-based artists, it has been a great way to actually kind of confine themselves or ourselves,
Mhm.
so to speak, and really to be able to focus on work. Whereas for some others, the it's been really difficult to focus on
Yeah.
studio work. And so I guess I'm hearing you're saying that for you, you've been able to kind of tune in to what is happening in the studio and kind of home in on some of your questions.
Yeah, I feel like I have fewer distractions, and like I used to teach small private classes in my studio, like about 5 days a week. So that actually took up a lot of time. Um, but it was such a great way to kind of connect with people, and I had like such an amazing group of people come through my studio, and I do miss them and interacting with them. But I kind of feel like I've really felt sort of unhindered about using my space and leaving a mess on a table and those kinds of things. I think I'm always trying to accommodate other people, sort of. So it's been nice to kind of just be a little bit selfish and, work at my own pace as well. And it's kind of nice to like feel that it's socially acceptable to not see people.
I know. It's funny that it is, but yeah, for sure that it is that you
Mhm.
can just kind of cocoon a little bit. And do
Yeah.
you find that your ideas are sort of circulating in a different way because you've been able to do that?
Well, there's a lot of stuff that I'm thinking about in terms of just identity and how that shows up in my work. And I feel like a lot of the times, like even in grad school, I remember one of my teachers like asking me like about a celadon glaze that I had used on something, and wanting me to sort of talk about how that relates to my Korean heritage, and it really didn't at all. So I always felt sometimes there was this expectation to deal with my background. So I feel like there's a lot of stuff that I'm kind of just trying to work out, like
Mm.
why doesn't it show up in my work, or should it show up in my work? These are things I'm definitely kind of thinking about right now, especially.
Yeah, interesting. I think that, I mean, one aspect of your work that I love is the way that it is, the way a lot of your sculptural pieces are both figurative and botanical at the same
Hmm.
time. And they're sort of, they're very specific on one level, but also super not specific.
Yeah.
And it's actually really interesting to think about how some identity questions do come through in these more abstracted forms. I think
Hmm.
particularly because what I know of some of your earlier work is that it sort of skewed a little bit more to the figurative. So you've
Hmm.
always been like sort of coming up to the figurative in some way and
Yeah.
kind of stopping short and kind of making it abstracted or schematic. And that's a very different, or not different, but like particular way of approaching a sort of identity through figuration, but
Yeah.
through an abstracted figuration.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think some of the work I was making in grad school, the forms I was building were definitely referencing like the body, but not being overt about it being, a figure or some sort of personification. It was a kind of a personification, but I think I still couldn't quite figure out the language around that body of work. And so, I kind of got distracted and, making, because I have so many other, sort of aspects of my practice that relies on like commercial sort of projects. So I can really drop the sculpture practice for months at a time and then struggle to get back into it. So I kind of feel like I somewhat abandoned that series, and I don't really know how to reconnect with it because I still feel like it's very much sort of something that have an affection for, but maybe I still need to kind of resolve some of the sort of ideas
Mm.
around it and what it is and that kind of stuff. So
Interesting. So when you're saying that series, are you referring to that earlier grad school work that had a more
yeah,
overt
use
reference to the body?
amorphous,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
amorphous kind of
Well,
forms and figures.
interestingly, it does feel like there are some, figurations coming into your work in a more overt way. It seems like
Mm-hmm.
more recently with some images that you've posted. I don't know if you have some of them around the
I
studio that
do,
you could
yep.
show us. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Um,
actually tried to unpack a little bit so I could, they've just been collecting dust sitting on top of shelves. So should I flip the camera?
yeah,
Okay.
great.
All right. So I guess it was in the summer. It was probably
Wow.
spring. So I just kind of wanted to build like iconic sort of figures. There's something about symmetry that I think I'm really interested in. And, I feel like once you start to cock the hip on a figure, it becomes uh, like high art or something. So there's something,
I was thinking
about,
sassy, actually.
okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. So sassy. So there's something that I like about these really stoic kind of figures and really symmetrical. So those are two. Definitely influenced by like Art Deco kind of patterning.
Hmm.
And then I actually pulled this one out. So this is
Oh,
something
wow.
where I tried to get a little bit more asymmetrical
Hmm.
and just sort of do something a little more kind of dynamic in terms of the actual form. And I built this in like June, and I just don't know how to glaze it.
Mm.
So I feel like in terms of the surface, what I've been trying to do a little bit more is before, I officially feel like something's finished in terms of being built. Um, if I can build on aspects of like the decoration, then it kind of makes the decision making a little easier, when I'm glazing. And
Hmm.
I kind of feel like with this, because it's just such a smooth surface and it's like even consistency in terms of, you know, its cylindricalness, that I think I might start drilling holes into it and then maybe incorporating other parts onto the form. But I don't
Wow.
exactly know what that is. But
That's great. It's wonderful to be able to see a work in progress like this that is not
mhm.
just unfinished, but also you're still kind of thinking through and sort of asking questions about it.
Yeah,
Um,
for
so,
sure.
so I want to be clear that the surface that we're looking at, it's unglazed, you say. So it's like a bisque
Yeah,
fired surface that
yeah,
is
it's just
waiting to
bisque.
receive. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
And do the hands on there kind of pop off? Like sometimes it feels like you have some kind of lids that are or
Yeah,
enclosures, almost like corks maybe that are
yeah.
connected.
So
As
they
yeah.
come out.
Hmm.
I kind of think it was partially. Um, yeah, I don't know why I did that. It was a long time ago.
But you're thinking at
But
this point that they would come out in the finished object too, as opposed to being glazed in place or fused in place somehow.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I did this in grad school a lot too with a lot of my abstract kind of forms. I would always leave openings because there was a potential to do something with it.
Mm,
So even with the opening in the neck, maybe I'll build something that's, of a different material. Maybe I could go back to using, fiber sort of practices to kind of finish this thing, and maybe that section will actually be larger than the ceramic form, like maybe the weight will change in terms of,
mm.
what the material makeup of it is.
It's interesting to think of
Mm-hmm.
the hole or the void or the opening as being
Mm-hmm.
like the place where growth can happen, where something
Yeah.
can emerge out of, right? It's like a
Yeah.
kind of, not to get too much about it, but it's a little bit like fertility in a way. It's like a place where something can, out of which something can sprout or grow.
Yeah. Well, I think too, a lot of the times I kind of think my background is in, ceramics, but I think some people would think, oh, I think you're more of a sculptor, but I think there's still the vessel and volume that's always super important that I don't
Hmm.
forget about when I'm working.
Sure. So we're
Mm-hmm.
looking at at a flower sculpture too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a bit about that one?
Okay,
Wh-
so I also love to build things in sections. So this would sit inside of a vase. I think at some point it had a vase, but now I don't know where it is or what it was. Like it might now be a vase that's in the shop on my, on my website.
Uh-huh.
And then, for example, this piece too is another, flower form. But because the the stem area is so narrow, I was getting a lot of warping. So at some point, I decided, oh, make it just shorter, so I'll get less warping and just, you know, have it sit inside of its vase.
Mm.
But sometimes that, it can get complicated
For
where things
sure.
don't shrink in the same way that I would want it to, etc. It's just little technical things.
Yeah. So are you thinking that that is sort of a topper, you could say, for one of the sculptures could go in multiple bases or multiple pieces?
Yeah, a lot of the times I will build several vases for a top, but I think this actually it does have an existing vase that it should fit in. But
Mm.
because I'm often going backwards. Like now I've got to go back to working with greenware, like building something with wet clay to build something for something that's already bisqued or potentially fully fired. It's a little disorganized, but
I don't know. I mean, I love that idea of going backwards because I mean, in some way you're speaking to the absence of linearity as being the a creative process, right? So in
sure.
the with the kind of more figurative bisque piece, that well the way that the figure is kind of shaped or moving or dancing, it's very
Hmm.
much seems to be embodying kind of that very a sort of absence of linearity or linear thinking, and that it's that sense of questioning of like which aspects of the work you'll take forward. In a way, you have to go backward in order to understand what it would even mean to go forward, and it's kind of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the times too, I just have to start from the beginning. Like maybe something didn't work out. So for example, I'll show you this one piece. So I'm just basically showing you things that did not work out.
That's great. This is like a seconds tour of Julie Moon's studio.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
Okay, so
amazing. Look at that one. Cool.
this eyeball, it's supposed to be a candle holder, but because for some reason sorry to make this a little strange. I love a narrow base. So it's not, the base itself is not narrow, but the sections down here are. And so it, it just has to warp like 1/8 of an inch, and the whole thing is now
it like magnifies it on the top. Yeah.
It would be a very unsafe candle holder.
It would be amazing though. Could you imagine like having candles in there and sitting around it? Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually, there's little things that I drop into the sockets that holds the candle, but I actually was thinking, because I do like to kind of play around. So, if I actually have the candle and there's that space around it, I just kind of feel like it's a little bit more interesting. And then to see it kind of shrink down, it's almost like the eyes are swallowing the candle.
Right.
So this is definitely something I want to remake. I have to resolve this area down here. And because I'm nervous it's going to fall over when I'm in the studio, I've been laying it down. But then there's something really interesting about reorienting it, and maybe it's a piece that I just stop here.
Yeah.
And then maybe it's something you can wear around your neck. Like, I don't know. Like, I just feel like sometimes, nothing's really ever finished. There's always potential to keep developing the idea.
Well, when this one's lying down too, the eyes are kind of looking at you, right?
Yeah.
So it has a very, very different aspect to it for sure.
Yeah, but it's very Sesame Street though when I look at it from this perspective. So,
right. I hadn't thought of that maybe.
Yeah, I might change it up a little.
This is a great one to ask you about the surface, because it has a pretty elaborated surface treatment that in some ways is emblematic of your work. Can you speak about sort of surface design and pattern and where your thinking is coming from?
Yeah, well, I definitely, love like a lot of illustrators and textile designers, very graphic kind of illustration and artwork. So, yeah, I tend to just paint like with glazes as though I'm like coloring in, like it's a coloring book. So even like on this bouquet, it's very much that, I'm just kind of, I'll draw on with pencil and then go in with my colors and then just paint like a coloring book. But I do find that it's really difficult on my hands, especially like doing really detailed work, also because I do the jewelry. And I've been trying to figure out ways to kind of make the surface a little bit more interesting just from the glaze itself. But I'm not very good at glaze chemistry, so I feel like I've been struggling with that. I'm
curious, do you use do you like draw out patterns on paper? Like do you work out some of the shapes and patterning and imagery on paper and then apply it to 3 dimensions, or kind of what's the translation?
Yeah, so sometimes when I'm building, so for example, like with this piece, I kind of will think about how I want to glaze something, but I don't quite know. And then with this guy, I actually, took photos of him when he was green and then just printed it, and then I'll just take markers and color on top.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
So it kind of helps me visualize. Like if I was better at Illustrator, in Photoshop, I would be able to do that, but
I was going to ask you, actually, do you like using digital tools and image manipulation, or are you more kind of markers and color pencils?
Yeah, I'm definitely analog.
Okay.
Yeah.
So also thinking about the patterning still, maybe either on the candelabra or on one
Hmm.
of the figures, you know, when we started, one thing you had said is that you've been thinking more about some identity questions over the last
Yeah.
year and how that comes through in your work. And I'm wondering if there are ways that you feel like it comes through in either, say, the candelabra or the figure pieces that you were just on in ways that maybe you're coming to see or perceive.
Hmm. Well, I was talking to my sister about this, and trying to figure out, if you grow up in the culture, are you assimilating to the culture? Like I feel like we grew up on television and, pop culture, and I was obsessed with like kind of hippie culture when I was in high school, and that kind of never left me. So a lot of, the work that I look at are, 60s poster designs, Alan Aldridge or Peter Max, or, some Japanese artists were doing some really amazing poster designs and graphic designs or illustration, in the 60s and 70s. And I look at a lot of that, you know.
Mm.
Uh, so I feel like I definitely, even like cartoons, I remember Angelo DiPetta, was my undergrad teacher at OCAD, and remember him saying to me, "You got to be careful. Your work's going to get too cartoony." I was so offended because I was like, well, what's wrong with cartoons?
Right. Yeah. 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 Although
So
you yourself just said it, these look a little Sesame Street-ish, right?
yeah, so I have to. There's kind of a fine line where sometimes things can become a little cartoonish,
Hmm.
and maybe some people do think it is cartoonish, but for me, there is a clear boundary, but couldn't exactly tell you what that is. But
Yeah, sure.
um,
I guess there's also the question of the textile work that you did, or the
hmm
work in the fashion industry that you did before you started in ceramic, and
hmm
kind of how that is either coming through or not coming through, or impacting some of the ways you're thinking about surface and patterning. Do you see it in sort of more
yeah.
grounded ways?
Well, if I think about like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm just showing you different things in the
Yeah, that's
studio.
great.
Like,
Cool, for
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Um, so, when I was designing clothes, a lot of the times it wasn't that I would sit down with a sketchbook and just start drawing designs. It would
Hmm.
always start with the material first,
Mm.
and so I think for me, with ceramics, you're building your own material, like you're creating a form or something that has a surface. And so, when I was in the fiber arts program at OCAD, I was I didn't actually do a lot of textile design because I don't really think that program was sort of designed for that. Like it was a bit more artistic, so a lot of people were making sculptures, and
Hmm.
um so I was building forms or armatures and then stretching fabric across, like over them.
You were making ceramics, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I was doing exactly the same thing. And then I think too, I always, I really like clung to this idea of like, fashion was about creating, surface, like using the body as like a surface for, you know, other things.
Mm. Hmm.
And so I think they were very much connected, you know.
It seems to me like this, I mean, both, clothing or fashion or textiles kind of in the broad sense, and ceramics have in common this aspect that there's an element of form, right? Like there's a body. So in the works that we're looking at, it's, a literal representation of a body, or in the case of
Hmm.
clothing, it's the human body. There's a three-dimensional form, and then there's a two-dimensional surface on top of that, right?
Yeah.
That you perceive in different ways depending on the shape of the body and the movement of that body in space, which maybe is like in a vase on a table as you walk by or something like that.
Hmm.
So there's a kind of complex interplay, I think, between form and surface in both of these pursuits that seems to be very much a part of what you're engaging with or asking about, is how these
Yeah.
elements are related to each other.
Yeah. I think, um, yeah, like I think the surface is a way to just sort of add more,
Yeah.
to be more expressive, to give more information, to show your taste, or, even if it's fashion, because I do think sometimes when I look at sort of the trajectory of my work, like it does kind of ebb and flow with certain trends. when I first started out, everyone was interested in porcelain and slip casting, and there was a part of me that was also kind of explored that and using decals, and then it kind of moved to stoneware eventually, and leaving pinch marks on things, and I think that's also something that's very prevalent right now. But I used to kind of be a little bit insecure about that, but because sometimes I think the ideas in my work move really quickly,
Mm-hmm.
and it's hard for me even to kind of connect them sometimes. But I know that I know that there is always something there for me to identify with, and a lot of the times it's just process.
Mm-hmm.
Like I just love the process. I never get bored. There's always something to kind of,
Just
get
sort of
you
move you
excited
along.
about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, I
Hmm.
think from the viewer end, there's one of the things that's amazing about your work is that from these pieces we're looking at now to the floral
Hmm.
ones to the more kind of
Hmm.
commercial work that you do, they're all very
Yeah.
clearly your work. Like there's some element of you that just
Hmm.
like zooms through all of these, which is amazing.
Yeah.
So these are fantastic. We don't have a ton of time though, and I
Yeah.
would love to touch on like your jewelry and your vases and some of your more kind of functional stuff. And I'm curious how those whole sets of ideas kind of interact with the sculptural work that you do. So
Well,
mugs, jewelry,
hmm
vases, and how are those related to the broader scope of your work?
well, I think it's a way for me to be able to like start something and finish something quickly. Like it kind
Right.
of gives me a sense of gratification,
Yeah, for sure.
because as you can see, there are pieces that have been sitting here for months that have not been finished, whether they're bisqued or partially glazed. um, I can kind of abandon things and go back to them later.
Mm,
So the pots, I never used to feel comfortable making pots because I feel like I'm not that fast, because I'm strictly a hand builder. But yeah, it's a really good way to work out different glazing techniques and, surface designs on things that are more manageable and less time consuming.
hmm
Um, and the jewelry, definitely, it the certain techniques and materials that I use always end up kind of like being the same materials I use for the sculptural work. Plus it helps me like financially and giving me a sense of like, you know, less insecure about sort of, supporting myself based on just sculpture sales.
for sure.
So
Yeah.
it's really, I can't believe I've been making jewelry since grad school, you know, but
And it's well loved, like, and widely worn too. I think that's,
well, that's good. Yeah.
yeah, 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 fantastic thing. I mean,
Hmm.
so as maybe a final question here is before we wrap up, but as a self-declared introvert who's kind of enjoyed having this year of quiet, what are you thinking about now as we start looking toward the possibility? Of course, we don't know how and exactly when, but the possibility of us all kind of opening up and reconnecting a little more in person. Are
Yeah.
there, is there something that you have in mind that you're either looking forward to or that you're working toward or wanting to do or
I want to go
thinking about?
drinking with friends.
Yeah.
I want to like imbibe and like have a good time and just socialize beyond, just like Zoom or whatever,
Yeah.
porch visits. Um, like yeah, I feel like there's so much to talk about, and because there's so much that's happened in the
hmm
last year.
hmm
So I do feel really excited to see people, and maybe it'll just be like for a few outings, and then I'll go retreat back into
And
my
then you'll,
little studio cave
right,
and
very
emerge at
good.
Christmas or something. But yeah, I am really looking forward to seeing people and just, want to get a massage and a haircut, things like
Right, right.
that. But
Feel a bit of
yeah, I
care.
do think that there's so much for us to kind of think about because of everything that's been happening, for
hmm
sure.
Wow. Well, I look forward to seeing you in person at some point and
Yeah,
to
me
seeing
too.
what you're making too, and to always be getting updates. So thank you so much for spending a bit of time with us. at the
Thanks,
Gardner.
Sequoia. It was great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Thanks
Great on our end
everybody
too.
for tuning in.
Yep. Thank you,
Looking
everyone. You
forward
can
to
visit
seeing you.
Julie, I think your website, juliemoon.com, I
Yeah,
believe. Sorry.
jewellerymoon.com.
Okay. And work at the Gardner shop too. So,
Yep.
yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, great.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Sequoia.
Yep.
Bye.
Toodaloo.